In the early 2000s, America seemed to be standing at the peak of unstoppable prosperity. Housing prices were soaring, Wall Street profits were breaking records, and millions of families believed the American dream. Owning a home, securing a stable future, was finally within reach. Banks encouraged ordinary citizens to borrow. Investors celebrated endless growth, and government officials reassured the public that the economy was stronger than ever. But beneath this glittering surface, a quiet storm was forming. Risky loans, complex financial products, and unchecked greed were piling up like dry wood waiting for a spark. When the fire finally came in 2007 to 2008, it spread faster than anyone imagined, consuming Wall Street, devastating Main Street, and shaking the global economy to its core. This is the story of how it happened, how America's financial system built itself on fragile foundations, how the cracks appeared, and how the collapse nearly brought down the world economy. The seeds of disaster. The bubble inflates. The crash, 1990s-2008. The roots of the 2008 crash can be traced back to the 1990s. After decades of regulations designed to prevent another Great Depression, Wall Street began pushing for deregulation. In 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act repealed key parts of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which had separated commercial banks, where people kept their savings, from investment banks, where risky trading took place. Now, banks could combine both activities, fueling massive growth, but also massive risk. At the same time, the U.S. housing market was heating up. Homeownership had long been considered the heart of the American dream. Encouraged by politicians who wanted to expand access to housing, banks began offering subprime mortgages, loans to people with poor credit histories, who normally would not qualify. These loans carried higher interest rates and were much riskier, but they promised big profits. Wall Street didn't stop at issuing loans. Banks discovered they could bundle thousands of mortgages into complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities, MBS, and collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. These were sold to investors worldwide, pension funds, insurance companies, even foreign governments, who were told they were safe thanks to inflated credit ratings from agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's. The system created a cycle. The more mortgages banks issued, the more securities they could sell. The more securities they sold, the more profits they made. To keep the machine running, lenders lowered their standards, approving loans to nearly anyone, so-called ninja loans, given to people with no income, no job, and no assets. By the early 2000s, the housing market was red-hot. Prices doubled in some areas, construction boomed, and families believed real estate values could only rise. Wall Street and Washington both celebrated the new economy. Few wanted to ask whether the system was built on sand. Between 2003 and 2006, the housing bubble reached its peak. Mortgage brokers aggressively targeted low-income families, often misleading them about adjustable-rate mortgages. That began with low teaser rates but later skyrocketed. Television ads promised easy home loans, and entire neighborhoods were built on speculative demand. Wall Street's appetite grew insatiable. Firms like Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Goldman Sachs invested billions in mortgage-backed securities to amplify profits. They used leverage, borrowing huge sums to buy even more assets. By 2007, some banks were leveraged 30-to-1, meaning for every $1 they owned, they borrowed $30. a small decline in housing values could wipe them out. Meanwhile, credit default swaps, CDS, essentially insurance contracts on these securities, became a booming industry. Companies like AIG, American International Group, sold trillions in swaps, promising to cover losses if securities defaulted. But AIG never set aside enough capital to cover potential claims. The financial world convinced itself that housing prices could never fall nationwide. Even Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan dismissed warnings, insisting that markets could regulate themselves. Regulators looked the other way. Rating agencies handed out AAA grades, and Wall Street bankers collected record-breaking bonuses. By 2006, cracks were forming. Housing prices plateaued, then began to decline in overheated markets like Florida, California, and Nevada. Homeowners with adjustable-rate mortgages suddenly faced payments they could not afford. Mortgage defaults began to rise. What seemed like a small problem was about to spiral into catastrophe. In 2007, the subprime mortgage market collapsed. Lenders like New Century Financial went bankrupt as defaults surged. Banks and investors holding mortgage-backed securities realized the assets they thought were safe were rapidly losing value. By 2008, panic had spread across Wall Street. Bear Stearns, one of the oldest investment banks, collapsed in March and was sold to J.P. Morgan Chase for pennies on the dollar, with government support. That summer, the crisis deepened. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored mortgage giants, were taken into federal conservatorship. The breaking point came on September 15, 2008, when Lehman Brothers, holding over $600 billion in assets, filed for bankruptcy, the largest in U.S. history. The collapse sent shockwaves through global markets. Stocks plummeted, credit froze, and businesses found themselves unable to borrow for daily operations. Days later, AIG teetered on the brink due to its exposure to credit default swaps. The U.S. government stepped in with an $85 billion bailout to prevent a total meltdown. Panic spread worldwide. European banks revealed their own exposure, and the crisis became global. By late 2008, the U.S. economy was in free fall. The stock market lost nearly half its value. Unemployment soared past 10%, and millions of families lost their homes to foreclosure. Homelessness spiked, retirement savings evaporated, and faith in the American financial system was shattered. Aftermath and lessons, 2009, present. In response, the U.S. government launched massive interventions. In October 2008, Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, allocating $700 billion to stabilize banks. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero and pumped liquidity into the financial system. Slowly, the panic subsided, but the human cost was enormous. Between 2007 and 2010, over 8 million jobs were lost and more than 6 million homes were foreclosed. The crisis wiped out $19 trillion in household wealth, leaving deep scars on the middle class. The fallout reshaped politics. Anger over Wall Street bailouts fueled movements across the spectrum. The Tea Party on the right and Occupy Wall Street on the left. Ordinary Americans questioned why bankers walked away with bonuses, while families lost everything. In 2010, the U.S. passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, imposing stricter regulations on banks, creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, and attempting to prevent another meltdown. Yet debates continue over whether these reforms went far enough. Globally, the 2008 crash triggered financial crises. That spread to Europe, sparking sovereign debt meltdowns in countries like Greece and Spain, and reshaping global economic policy for decades. The 2008 financial crash was not just a story of numbers and markets. It was a human tragedy. It exposed the dangers of unchecked greed, regulatory failure, and blind faith in markets. It showed how decisions made in the boardrooms of Wall Street could devastate families in Detroit, Dallas, or Denver. More than a decade later, the lessons of 2008 remain urgent. Could it happen again? Are today's safeguards strong enough? Or is the system still vulnerable to new risks? The crash reminds us that prosperity built on fragile foundations can collapse overnight, and that vigilance, transparency, and accountability are essential for a stable future. What do you think? Did America truly learn the lessons of 2008? Or are we at risk of repeating history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Watch even more incredible stories on our channel. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a new episode of rule-changing stories.